The defence budget game, and it is a game, is a very clever one. It's always premised on fear, not on need.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this week the Labor government announced more details about the AUKUS nuclear submarine program, including the eye-watering estimated cost of the program, which will come in at a whopping $368 billion over the next 3 decades.
The biggest military build-up in Australian history was unveiled by the Prime Minister in San Diego this morning.
A historic $368 billion submarine deal.
With the US and UK, will see our nation go nuclear.
For us to buy and eventually build nuclear-powered submarines.
The biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history.
It's an unusual name, AUKUS. But it's a powerful entity.
New boats will replace the existing Collins-class fleet, but there are concerns about a capability gap as the ageing submarines are retired and the new ones are built in Adelaide.
Dramatically uplift the skills base here in South Australia.
The worst deal in all history. That's how former Prime Minister Paul Keating savaged the...
the idea that we need American submarines to protect us, if we buy 8, 3 are at sea, 3 are going to protect us from the might of China. I mean, how deeply pathetic is that?
A deal made between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom. The AUKUS agreement will see Australia purchase at least 3 US nuclear submarines, part of a huge change for Australia, which has only ever previously had conventional submarines. This has profound implications for Australia's defence and foreign policy, and to help us explore these new details that have been revealed this week, I'm talking to International and Security Affairs Director at the Australia Institute, Alan Bean. G'day, Alan.
Good morning, Ebony.
So, Alan, what have we learned this week that we didn't know about this deal last week?
I think we've learnt a lot. We've learnt how long it's going to take us, virtually forever. And we've learnt that, as you mentioned, it's going to cost an absolute mozza. And of course, that's only the projected program cost in whatever year-based dollars the government is using for this. The outturn cost, you can assume, will be about 3 times greater. So this is effectively $1 trillion program over a period of, say, about 4 decades. And I think it's worth, Ebony, just putting a little bit of perspective around that. It's a longer period than it took to get from the armistice at the end of the First World War in 1918 to the armistice that we got to when there was a cessation of hostilities on the Korean Peninsula in 1953. And as I recall it, Eb, quite a lot happened between 1918 and 1953.
The world did change quite a bit.
It changed a lot, and so did technology. We went from biplanes in the First World War to jet fighters during the Korean War, and we went from gravity bombs in the First World War to nuclear weapons in the Second World War. So a lot happens over that kind of time frame, and yet we're looking at a capability which has been now in operation by the United States, the former Soviet Union, Britain and France for over 50 years. So it's a funny thing to do to get a tried and true system in 40 years' time from now to deal with things that we can't even imagine. So it is an extraordinary set of decisions.
And it comes with an eye-watering price tag, $368 billion.
Australia will acquire a fleet of up to 8 nuclear-powered submarines, which will cost up to $368 billion over the next 30 years.
The mammoth, decades-long outlay raises the question of where the money's going to come from and whether the nation can afford it.
So I just want to stick with that price tag for a little bit. The $368 billion price tag, you've effectively said we should essentially triple that. It'll be $1 trillion by the time it's all over. I guess I have no problems believing this because it was only back in 2014 some submarines off the shelf were going to cost us, I think, $40 billion, and now we're at nearly $400 billion. That's the element that a lot of people are focusing on because it is truly just a massive figure. It dwarfs a lot of other things in the budget. Does that represent value for money for Australia or for our defence?
Not on the arguments that have been offered already, Eb. I mean, we don't know essentially what the value proposition is, apart from remarks that were made on the ABC 7:30 report last night. We've never come to any clear conclusion as to why on earth we need to go into very big nuclear-propelled submarines and why it is necessary to get the numbers that we've projected, and why it's necessary to do it in 3 phases. It is a set of spending plans that are not fully articulated by the government. And I think for that reason, we've got to think about that cost in terms of what is it we're not going to get in order to afford what we may not need. I think that's a very serious question for the government and a serious question for taxpayers. And just to go a little bit further into that, the fact is that Australia is a rich country. We can afford whatever we want to afford.
Well, clearly.
But we can't afford everything we want to afford. And that's the big problem in doing a budget. The opportunity costs here are going to be enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's where the debate has already turned. It feels like it's going to have big implications for how we talk about budgets for years to come. You have often spoken, Alan, in your work about where do we derive security from for the community? And I guess I'm thinking of the opportunity cost here. We've already had the opposition leader identify cuts to the NDIS, for example, as a way to meet the costs of this program. What will that mean for people's security as everyday Australians over the coming decades if we're cutting government spending on services?
Well, Ebony, that is the fundamental question in a democratic society, isn't it? It's not surprising that a government which saw the brutalisation of very vulnerable people through the robo-debt thing would be thinking about cutting the NDIS. That's not surprising. There are savings to be made everywhere where you can pick on those who can't actually do much for themselves. And that actually goes to the heart of the question. It's this: how can you have a secure nation if the people who live in it aren't secure themselves? And by security here, we mean the security that enables people to look after their children when they're little, to have very, very good childcare, not just so that men and women can all of them equally participate in the workforce, but also to ensure that children have a really sound basis to grow up, go to school, and themselves go and have a good career. How can we have a secure nation if people don't have access to the sorts of educational opportunities that we have traditionally had in this country? How do we have a secure nation if people, when they're old, can't look forward to a dignified retirement and high-quality aged care? How can we have a secure country when our roads are full of potholes, as they are at the moment after La Niña, and we've got billions of dollars of outstanding payments to be made to people caught in floods, people who were caught in the fires 4 years ago? I mean, we've got enormous amounts of money that we do need to spend in Australia if our people themselves are to enjoy the benefits of a democratic society and to live a secure life. Now, those things have to be addressed by all governments in Australia. It's not good enough to say, well, we're going to protect you from some putative enemy when in fact you're sleeping in the park already.
Yeah. And Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister, said that he and the government will do what is necessary when it comes to spending on defence, but it's certainly not the attitude we take when it comes to things or threats like climate change, for example. It's a very marked difference. I want to turn now to the implications for defence and foreign affairs because, as I mentioned in the introduction, moving towards having nuclear submarines is a very different pathway for Australia. What implications does it have for defence policy in particular, do you think?
Look, I think for defence policy there are two major implications here. I'll deal with the easier one first, and that is that there will necessarily be adjustments within the defence budget spend itself. Government is going to look to see what things are on the wish list that can be taken off the wish list and what things have been planned and perhaps even projected that might be subject to revision downwards. So I think the first thing will be to look for what are the opportunity costs within the defence budget itself. I think the second thing is much more difficult and it's a much bigger issue, and that is that to acquire these platforms locks us in to the design and operation of submarines which are not ours. Whatever one might say about the Collins project, and I happen to think that the Collins project was a rip-roaring success, actually. It had its bumps and ups and downs, but we were able to build, using a Swedish fundamental design, but we changed it quite a lot, 6 really, really excellent conventional submarines that the Americans looked at and thought, these guys can penetrate our fleet screens. These are very good submarines, and during my time in defence, I had admirals tell me that. American admirals tell me that. So here we are going down a path where the design, the engineering, the operational characteristics are all really within the hands of either the United States or the United Kingdom. Now, the problem here is not actually one of sovereignty. I think that problem is a solvable problem. I think what we're facing here is a systems dependency which gives us no out when things go wrong. If we think that we're going to operate an American or a British submarine at a time when the Americans or the British are probably operating their submarines at the same intensity we want to operate ours, then we are caught at the end of a long string. And that part of our defence planning actually does worry me a lot. That is, we're trading off the ability to exercise our own agency as and when we want to exercise it against the likelihood that the providing party will want to exercise their agency as and when they want to. And I don't think we've got a solution to that problem.
And you can imagine that if, things come to the crunch and we are in a conflict, or, as you said, the United Kingdom or the United States is wanting to look after their own needs first, we only need to see how countries operated in the pandemic to know that we'll go straight to the back of the queue.
Oh, look, it's every man for himself and dog eat dog all at once, if I can mix up a couple of metaphors. And, it's the worst sort of possible scenario that you can think of, and maybe it won't work that way. But when you're doing defence planning, you do have to plan for the worst outcomes. And what is deeply worrying for me is that by going down this path in the way that we're going down this path, we are opening up consequences over which we will have no control. And I think that is actually bad planning.
A 4,000-tonne boat like the Collins worked perfectly around the Australian coast because it was designed to protect Australia. It wasn't designed to sit off the Chinese coast seeking Chinese submarines. The Chinese can also shoot our submarines because we're in the shallow water and we are detectable. We could have 50 Collins-class boats and 15 at sea, and we'd have a much stronger defence than this rubbish that the government's doing.
If there is foreign oversight or supervision or assistance without which that capability cannot be deployed, then it is not fully sovereign, because if the other country said, you know what, we don't want to help you anymore with this, then you're stuck.
Part of the announcement was that we're going to be buying some off the shelf to help fill a capability gap. And then the other part of the plan seemed to be that we're going to be investing in the UK and the United States' capability to produce submarines that we eventually will acquire. That's a very different approach, as you said, to being able to build and operate the Collins-class subs entirely within Australia that we've had in the past. It's a big trade-off.
It is. And again, it may be good planning to make that trade-off, but you need to have in place a whole lot of guarantees that you will not be left high and dry in circumstances that you actually have to be able to use your capability. Look, used Virginia-class submarines are not off the shelf. They're just used Virginia-class submarines. We'll have to fix them too, and I'd have to say that our history of second-hand acquisition from the United States is not a happy one. We have bought old American equipment before and then had to pay much more than the purchase price to get them working. And this is entirely possible, as I understand it at the moment. There are a number of Virginia-class submarines that are lined up awaiting repairs in the United States. They're having a lot of problems in keeping both the new build and the repair of submarines underway in the two construction yards that they've got. And hence Australia is being asked, or we are offering, to cough up what I think will be a very substantial amount of money. I suspect it's the $3 billion difference between 6 and 9 that we're projecting over the forwards to assist the United States in being able to repair their broken submarines so that we potentially might purchase 3 or even 5.
With respect to our neighbours and how we operate in the region. So obviously Australia has taken this decision, but other countries will have different ways of greeting this decision. What are some of the implications for Australia in terms of foreign policy as distinct, I guess, from defence?
Well, they're pretty profound as well. We already know that Indonesia and Malaysia are thinking very, very carefully about whether they're going to grant access rights through their waters for these nuclear-powered submarines. They haven't come out and said that they're not going to do it, but Indonesia, very interestingly, has hinted that it does not want Australian submarines going through its waters if the transit of those submarines provokes China. So they're calibrating their responses not as a friend of Australia, but in trying to deal with their approach to what it means for China to be the top dog in Asia. In the Pacific, it's slightly different. The New Zealanders, at least under Prime Minister Ardern, made it immediately clear that they don't want Australian nuclear submarines going to New Zealand. And I don't think that policy position will change in New Zealand anytime soon. In the Pacific, it's a bit more ambiguous. The Prime Minister, on his return from San Diego, has popped into Fiji to have a chat with the new Prime Minister, Rambuka, and we'll see where that goes. Maybe the Fijians would be happy for us to berth there. And as for the other countries of the Pacific, that is still open for discussion. I think the same applies to other friends and colleagues in Southeast Asia. I don't know at this point exactly how the Philippines might respond to an Australian request to transit their waters. I would expect that Japan probably won't have much of a problem with it because they already welcome American nuclear-powered submarines. But all, in a region which is changing so rapidly, and particularly a region where Indonesia is going from where it is now to full membership of the G7 over the time frame that we're thinking about, we've got a lot of problems down the pike. And I don't think we're in a position at the moment to say where any of those problems are going to end and how they're going to be solved.
If there are crews from the US and Australia on board, in time of crisis, who gets the go, no-go veto on the use of a particular vessel for a particular task?
AUKUS security alliance is aimed at countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region.
Beijing has already baked in AUKUS into its calculations. It already knew that this was coming. Nothing that it saw yesterday would have surprised it.
We wanted to stabilise the relationship with China, and we want to re-engage more deeply with our region.
Underlying all this stuff about the need of nuclear power is the idea that China has threatened us or will threaten us. Now, this is a distortion and it's untrue.
This deal is always being talked about in the context of the rise of China and China being seen to be more, I guess, aggressive in its activities. What's your response to things like the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age last week that kind of was a warning that we could be at war with China within 3 years, which just seemed absolutely extraordinary to me?
Well, clearly somebody with my background would find the Red Alert series reprehensible. This is beating up what is problematic, but it's beating it up into a fear and threat issue, and that's not truly what it is. What it truly is a profound change in our strategic circumstances, because the economic and political and strategic rise of China is something that we've never had before. We don't know how to deal with it, and we evidently are worried about it. But whether that should make us fearful or not, well, evidently I think not. I will just say, sort of parenthetically, that this AUKUS program seems to have no relevance whatsoever to what's going to happen over the next 3 years. But I guess 3 years is at least...
on a 40-year time horizon.
Yes, but at least 3 years is 50% more than 2 years, which is what the American Air Force General told us we would be at war with China within. And so I guess we all know that we've got another year in which we can breathe and enjoy our lives. But Eb, I think there's one other point that is worth making overall in the context of the AUKUS decision by the government. And it's a somewhat more subtle point, and I want to reflect back to question time on Thursday last week, when the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, in an extraordinary act of quote-unquote bipartisanship, acknowledged the role of the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and the former Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, in the paternity of this remarkable AUKUS decision. And we heard sort of the sound of one hand clapping as people said, oh, bipartisanship, isn't that a wonderful thing? I'd offer an entirely different view about what happened in question time. What I think has actually happened in Australia is that the Albanese government has stolen the crown jewels of the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party boasts that it is the party of national security, and Labor has gone after them on this and has delivered an AUKUS result which I think far exceeds the imagination of the previous government. That's the first point I would make about it. The second point I'd make, and it's sort of related to that, is that the government is evidently concerned that this may not transpire, that there are so many unknowns between 2023 and what might happen in the 2060s, including just in the project design and build. So I think what we've seen is a bit of preemptive blame sharing, that immediately you announce the program, you say, well, the guy really responsible for this is the former Prime Minister and his Defence Minister, so there, if it doesn't work, it's for them to take the blame. And I think the third thing, and this is also, I think, germane to this whole issue around where we stand on the AUKUS submarine, is that the acquisition of these submarines is premised on a set of ideas on which there is actually not fundamental agreement in Australia. And when you look at the internal politics of the AUKUS decision, I think we have grounds for quite a lot of concern. I mean, it's clever of the Labor Party to take the crown jewels of the Liberal Party. I think that it is very clever of the Labor Party to, politically, to announce a big decision like this because they need to get it off the table. Labor parties are actually not elected for defence reasons, except maybe in 1945. Labor parties are normally elected for social policy reasons. So I think that there's a very strong tendency in the government at the moment to get AUKUS off the table and to get on with the real business of running a complex Commonwealth in a very constrained fiscal environment. So quite beyond all of the foreign policy and defence policy things, I think we should be looking at this AUKUS decision in terms of the raw politics of Australia. And that also I find very interesting.
I do too.
I supported it, with everything I had. I thought it was in our best interest. It's in our best interest that it be strengthened, and that's what we achieved through the agreement that we struck.
It strikes me, we had a big kerfuffle last week and the week before about a broken promise from Labor over superannuation tax concessions, the most modest of proposals. Yet apparently the coalition government can rip up $100 billion submarine deal and take our defence policy in an entirely different direction with nuclear submarines. And I don't recall us ever having a big public debate about that. It all happened before there was... the Defence Minister didn't even know that this deal was in the offing, as it turns out, at the time. Why does defence policy get made in these little bubbles that seem to be immune from democratic discussion compared to how we seem to do other policies? Is it just... Why is this so different? Why is it acceptable that this is the way that things happen? Or I don't know, I guess just a reflection on the way that this policy came into being, because it strikes me as being very different from how a lot of other policy discussions happen and are formed.
The defence budget game, and it is a game, is a very clever one. First of all, it's always premised on fear, not on need. What happens in Australia, whether it's terrorism or defence policy, is we're fearful as a nation anyway. We've long had this fundamental insecurity in our national makeup. Dates from 1788 when the supply ships didn't arrive for 2 years. We've been fearful ever since then. And that's what makes us look for a protector all the time, for instance. So when you're frightened, you're probably prepared to spend whatever you want to spend to deal with your fear. So I think the first thing is the politics of it allow governments to do that. The second thing is that defence is brilliant at pushing everything out into future years so that you don't bring them to book in the current budget cycle. And you can see that already.
Yeah.
We're talking about $9 billion over the forwards, that's the next 4 years, but we're talking about another $380 billion out on the never. And that is pretty extraordinary. And I think the other side of this particular thing, and it comes back to the domestic politics, and I feel that the government has again been quite clever in setting the preliminary groundwork for another go at stage 3 tax cuts. Already the opposition has had to say, oh yes, this is a very serious decision. We will do whatever we can to meet budget repair and to make sure that this is affordable. I think that bluff is going to be called straight away, not by introducing the cessation of stage 3 tax cuts immediately. I think that will flow over until after the next election. But the announcements to do so will come, I think, pretty forthwith. Yeah. And that is quite a clever form of wedging. And given the premise of your question that, generally speaking, the Conservatives are extremely good at wedging Labor on defence matters, on budget discipline. Labor is always the high-taxing government. I think a bit of reverse wedging is on here too, which sort of appeals to my political instinct a bit.
It's going to be quite difficult for Peter Dutton, I think, as opposition leader politically, to be like, this is the very serious business of budget repair we have to look at now, and we're here in a bipartisan fashion to help you find the money for this program, but we're not going to touch the tax cuts, but we will go after the NDIS. That strikes me as a difficult political position.
I think that's going to be very hard to sustain. Look, the whole question of budgeting this is based around three quite different things, and none of them do we have a solution to. We either continue to print money and run massive deficits for the indefinite future. A number of countries in the world are doing that. Alternatively, we can screw down the budget and hurt people. The previous government wanted to get something like $6 billion out of very, very disadvantaged people through the robo-debt scheme. And if we don't do that, we can raise taxes. Now, each of those three options are pretty unpalatable politically for governments. So I suspect at the moment that what we're going to see is quite a deal of budgetary manoeuvre on the part of this government, and I dare say on the part of successive governments, because this is a massive adventure, a big, massive fiscal adventure, and at this point it's by no means clear how we're ever going to afford it and afford everything else.
There are billions of dollars going from Australia into the industrial shipbuilding base of both the United States and the United Kingdom. There will be money spent in Australia as well, of course, substantial amounts of money, but there is the big winners here financially are British shipbuilders and American submarine builders.
That we have returned to Britain 230 years after we left, after the British dumped us all through these years, that we're going to bail the British BAE Systems and British aerospace companies and submarine companies out.
It has enormous economic problems. I mean, Britain has 7 million people on the NHS waiting list. Is Britain going to be financially strong enough to be our partner in this submarine project of this significance?
They're on the bones of their bum, searching the world for the new Britain. And here we are in Asia, going back to Britain, after they've dumped us, completely dumped us all through the 20th century.
What is the history of defence projects like this? Are they delivered on time and on budget, generally speaking?
Ebony.
That's called a Dorothy Dixer.
That is a gimme ball, and I have to hit it for 6 runs, I'm afraid. I can't think of a single defence project that has ever been delivered on time or on budget. In my dim past, I was the Chief of Staff to the Junior Defence Minister, and we had 14 projects of concern which were way over time and way over budget. Some of them a result of the inability to measure the hole in which you need to put a boat to fit it on the back of a big boat, that is a ship, and that led to enormous problems with the LHDs, to the airborne early warning systems, where we have this super phased array radar sitting up on the top of aeroplanes, but we couldn't get it to work. And that required an enormous amount of additional expenditure, an enormous amount of additional time. And I'm only picking on 2. This project, as designed at the moment, in all probability won't work according to its design. And so there will inevitably be delays. Events will occur. We don't know how the war in Ukraine is going to end. Other events will most certainly occur. It's the point I made right at the beginning of this podcast. And more than that, we've seen the collapse of 2 banks in the United States in just the last week. We don't know whether we're headed at the moment towards some kind of a global recession, but certainly international economic commentators are talking about 2008 and the GFC. So we have a very, very uncertain set of conditions arising in the future. So all sorts of factors are going to bear in on whether or not this massive project over a massive time frame is going to be delivered in anything like a disciplined way.
Even though I want to talk about things like Port Kembla becoming, a harbour for nuclear submarines and a million other questions, I think we'll wrap it up there, Alan, and continue this conversation at a future point.
Thank you very much, Ebony.
Thank you. This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 15th of March 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you like today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting the Australia Institute with a small tax-deductible gift today. You can do that at australiainstitute.org.au, where you'll also find all our latest research and content. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Alan Beam is at Miranda Prosus. That's MIRANDAPRORSUS. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.